Today, 20th September, we start the day with news that EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is in Kiev, where she's having top-level talks with senior officials of the Ukrainian government, including, of course, President Zelensky himself. Now, there's been various explanations for her visit. Some are suggesting that she's gone to Kiev in order to try to cool Zelensky down in advance of his trip to New York and his participation in the UN General Assembly debates that are taking place there, and also perhaps to get Zelensky to be a little bit more realistic about his so-called victory plan. We will come to all of that shortly. But my own view, following an article I've just read in the Financial Times, is that the true purpose of her visit is mostly to discuss this vexed situation concerning the Western loan to Ukraine. In fact, supposedly, according to the Financial Times, she's going to arrive in Kiev and announce a 35 billion euro loan to Ukraine from the European Union, and is going to reassure the Ukrainians that this is only a part of the $50 billion loan that they were promised back in June by the G7, the $50 billion loan that was supposed to be paid off from the interest of the Russian frozen assets, and for the full payment of which the European Union was supposed to provide a guarantee. Now, I did recently discuss all of this in a program that I did a few days ago, but having actually read that original article in the Financial Times, the one that prompted me to make those comments several days ago, and having looked at the latest article, and having read around this whole topic, I've come to the realization that the $50 billion loan idea has undergone a significant evolution since I first saw it talked about or mooted, well, almost a year ago now. At that time, as I remember, the idea essentially was as follows. The loan would be raised on the international financial markets. It would presumably take the form of bonds issued by, one assumes, Ukraine. The bonds would be floated on the international money markets up to a value of $50 billion. There'd be bids, there'd be offers to sell these bonds to the financial community, the pension funds, the trust funds, the hedge funds, the actually extremely high net worth individuals who go into the market and buy bonds. And the guarantee, the assurance that these people in the financial markets would be given would be that they would be paid, they would have a certain route of payment, because the bonds would be paid independently of Ukraine's own internal domestic problems from the interest of the Russian frozen assets, and that they need not worry about the legality of that, because the whole thing would be guaranteed by the European Union, where, of course, the bulk of these assets are located. So that was the original plan, and it makes a kind of sense, because the whole point about a loan was to get round the issue of the growing unpopularity of direct funding to Ukraine by Western governments, which of course has to be authorized by Western parliaments. Increasingly, more and more parliaments, the US Congress first and foremost, and by the way, it was resistance in the US Congress as I remember, which first led to this idea, this plan being launched at all. But other Western parliaments are also becoming increasingly sceptical. Anyway, getting Western parliaments to authorize direct funding of Ukraine, actual issue of funds, including loan funds to Ukraine, covered by payment receipts of European taxpayers, was judged to be increasingly difficult. It was assumed that this was going to be increasingly problematic, and therefore this idea of the loan floated in the international financial markets, paid from the interest of the Russian assets and secured by the guarantees that the European Union would provide, was appealing because it meant that funding could be provided to Ukraine without Western parliaments and specifically Congress having to be involved at all. It would be a Ukrainian loan paid in this very complicated way that I've spoken about. Well, at some point over the subsequent months, it seems to have gradually dawned on people in the G7 that that simply wasn't going to work. Presumably soundings were taken, and it was discovered that the financial markets would almost certainly turn their back on a loan of this kind. Ukraine does not look in the kind of financial health where it can afford to borrow money, and there are legal questions about the possibility of using interest from frozen Russian assets to pay the bonds. And there's also there would also be doubts about the real value of whatever guarantees the European Union were to give. A further point, I suspect, is one that has been made recently by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, which is that, on the face of it, the Russian frozen assets are not producing enough income, enough interest income, to actually repay the bonds, any such bonds, in any remotely acceptable space of time. So it looks as if sometime, maybe around June, somebody in the West, some leading officials in the West, came to the understanding that this original plan wasn't going to fly. And, well, they'd already talked about a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. The Ukrainians had been promised this. There'd been much discussion about this in the media. One of the consistent aspects of the Ukrainian crisis is that bad ideas never go away. So some other way had to be found to proceed with this loan. And the idea of floating it on the financial markets appears to have been dropped. And it's now clear to me, and it's become particularly clear from the latest article in the Financial Times, the way it was to be done was through direct funding by Western governments. So Western governments, the United States, European governments would get their parliaments to authorize direct funding for Ukraine in the form of loans. The United States would provide a loan of $20 billion. The European Union, the various member states of the European Union, would provide a loan of around $20 billion, with the member states, the breakdown of the European Union's share being distributed amongst the EU member states according to their economic weight, which means, by the way, that Germany would have had to pay a significant part of it, perhaps $7-8 billion, just guessing. Anyway, and that would all be packaged together in a loan. The Europeans would provide 20 billion, the Americans would provide 20 billion, and the remaining 10 billion would be stomped up by the governments of Japan, South Korea, and Canada. And that seems to have been the plan that was arrived at in the summer, the G7 plan at that time. Now, of course, that then leads to the problem that such an arrangement would indeed have to pass through various parliaments. Parliaments would have to vote for these kind of appropriations. Even if Western governments were to themselves go out into the financial markets and borrow money, which they would then convert into loans for Ukraine. They would have to increase their net borrowing, and at some point, in some form, their parliaments would have to be consulted. And I, by the way, would say that I think any such step in many countries would be deeply controversial. The idea, for example, of Germany or France going into debt in order to provide a loan to Ukraine, I think would be a difficult sell in those countries. Just saying. So anyway, there we go. That was the next plan. That was the further plan that people came up with in the summer. And it's not difficult to see, well, why it is now running into problems, because trying to get European parliaments, and by the way, Congress, to authorize such funding for Ukraine at this time is going to be an extremely hard sell indeed. And that probably is the true reason why the $50 billion loan idea at the moment is running into all kinds of problems. It is, of course, the case that there are also legal issues which might make European governments, some European governments, including Hungary's government, wary of agreeing to provide loan guarantees for these loans, something that the Americans and apparently the British are insisting on. They're insisting that because the frozen assets are in the European Union, if there's any problems with those frozen assets and the income from the frozen assets, the European Union must guarantee that any loans issued by Britain, the United States, Canada, South Korea, and Japan must continue to be paid, and that the European Union will assume liability for the repayment in that case. So undoubtedly that is a problem, but I suspect also, and beyond this, there is a fundamental concern now that parliaments, Congress in the United States, parliaments in various European countries, it's now been assessed or understood, are not going to be keen on authorizing direct financing of Ukraine in this way. And in fact, I recall that just a week ago, I read a report in the US media, I forget where, that the Biden administration had actually undertaken soundings in Congress to find whether a further appropriation for Ukraine would be supported in Congress, and the response was overwhelmingly negative, including, by the way, from Democrats. In advance of the November elections, no one, apparently in Congress, wants to go down the route of further funding for Ukraine at this time. Certainly they do not want it to be an election issue. And to anticipate, I think the problems in some other parliaments in Europe are going to be even greater. So this is why the loan is stuck. This is the underlying true reason why the loan is stuck. There are legal problems, undoubtedly, but there are political problems as well. And to repeat the point I made in my previous program where I discussed this question of the loan, these problems extend beyond Hungary. The fact that the Hungarians, and I am sure several others, are unwilling to agree to the kind of guarantees that the Americans, for example, are said to be insisting on. Well, that then leaves the whole situation of funding for Ukraine in limbo. So this is where we now see what Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission are trying to do. They're talking about a loan for Ukraine, which will be independent of the loan that the United States, the $50 billion loan. In fact, what the Commission appears to be saying is let's put the Americans to one side. Let's put the British, the Canadians, the South Koreans and the Japanese to one side as well. They might come on board later or maybe they won't, but let's go ahead in Europe with our part of the proposal. After all, guarantees, actual guarantees, are not really our concern because we were supposed to be the people who were going to provide the guarantees. So if we're not providing guarantees, well, that simply means that we're not taking on liabilities, but we can still go ahead and provide this loan. And that's where the figures of 20 to 40 billion euros came from, because 20 billion euros is, well, it's slightly less, but not that much less. Actually, it's slightly more than the $20 billion that the European Union was supposed to stomp up from its member states as part of the original $50 billion loan idea. So what Ursula von der Leyen is saying was, let's just go ahead and do it all by ourselves. Let's not worry about Congress. Let's not worry about the Americans and the British. Let's just go ahead with our part of it ourselves. And then, of course, the problem is that the Ukrainians need an awful lot more than $20 billion or 20 billion euros. So Ursula von der Leyen comes along and says, well, let's then increase that amount and go all the way up to 40 billion euros. And in other words, let's ourselves basically cover the entirety of the original loan. And it's quite clear that member states have collectively said no. This is simply not an option. We're not prepared to do that. Our parliaments would not agree. We can't just go on funding Ukraine, especially not if the Americans are not doing so. And that idea has been rejected. So she's got bad news to tell the Ukrainians, but of course she can't quite do that. So she's now taken the train and gone to Kiev, and she's telling the Ukrainians not to worry because the European Union will stomp up a loan. It won't be 40 billion euros. That's too much. But they're going to compromise on 35 billion euros. In other words, around $40 billion, which takes us exactly back to where we were. It's essentially covers the American part of the funding. So the European Union will provide the money, both the $20 billion that it committed itself to providing, and it will provide the $20 billion that the Americans were going to provide. And of course the others, the British, the Canadians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, no doubt they'll be invited to stomp up the $10 billion between them as well. And the Americans, well, they're going to be left completely off the hook because, as discussed, this isn't going to fly in Congress. So that's the plan. That's what Ursula von der Leyen is now intending to tell the Europeans. Well, I'm going to say straight away that this is a proposal from Ursula von der Leyen. Whether the Ukrainians believe it or not, I don't know. But it can only be a proposal because Ursula von der Leyen cannot commit the member states to agree to this. If we're talking about 35 billion euros, almost exactly $40 billion in loans from the European Union directly, then clearly this will have to be authorised by the various European parliaments. Each of them is going to have to vote on this. And by the way, there will also have to be a vote in the European Parliament. Now, the European Parliament is guaranteed to agree to this. There is a massive, fervid, pro-Ukrainian majority in the European Parliament. The European Parliament elections have somewhat reduced it, but it is still there. European parliaments are a completely different proposition. To start with, I have great difficulty believing that the French Parliament, the parliament that emerged out of the French parliamentary elections, in which two of the biggest blocs are the left-wing bloc, of which the nominal leader is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and the right-wing bloc, led by Marine Le Pen, that they will agree to a loan provided by France as part of a bigger European loan to be sent to Ukraine. I think politically it would be all but impossible for Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National to do. I think also Jean-Luc Mélenchon himself would almost certainly oppose it, and I think most of the members of his movement, France Unbowed, in the French Parliament, would go along with him. There are probably some left-wing MPs, members of the left-wing bloc, who might just possibly agree to support a loan idea like this. But whether there would be enough of them to provide this loan idea with a majority in the French Parliament, an idea that I suspect would be deeply unpopular at this time in France, well, about that, I have to say I have strong doubts. And I suspect the same problems would arise in other EU member states, in Italy, even in Germany, I suspect, at a time of budgetary crisis and spending cuts. This would be a controversial idea, to put it mildly. Now, all of this apparently has to be sorted out before the end of this year, because next year we're into a completely different budgetary cycle, and the European Union would have to start basically from scratch all over again if this was to be done. If this is to be done next year. So we have just a few weeks, a couple of months before the end of the year in which all of this has to be sorted out and done. Well, perhaps it will be. One should never underestimate the ability of the EU centre to impose pressures and of the willingness of some governments and parliaments, maybe that of Germany first and foremost, to agree to stomp up most of the funding here. But this looks like a very tall order to me. So Ursula von der Leyen dashing to Kiev, making promises to the Ukrainians, telling them that don't worry, you may be reading all these headlines in the Financial Times that tell you that you're not going to get your $50 billion, but we are going to provide you with $40 billion from Europe, and the rest will eventually come. They might be telling the Ukrainians that, but it seems to me that Ursula von der Leyen is at serious risk of making a promise upon which she may not be able to deliver. Write a check, if you like, which hasn't got the cash in the bank to back it. Anyway, we will see how this rather complicated and very interesting story plays out. But one way or the other, it's now quite obvious to me that this whole idea of providing funding to Ukraine from loans is creaking and starting to break down, even if the European Union is able somehow to strong-arm European parliaments to authorise this loan, even if Congress does approve some kind of contribution from the United States in the remaining weeks and months of this year. I suspect that there will be a great deal of anger and controversy, and a lot of goodwill is going to be used up. But anyway, let's keep an eye on all of this. It's fascinating to see how in the face of what some would say were either insuperable obstacles or at any rate significant political costs in plugging on with this, Ursula von der Leyen and the EU Commission remain obsessed, or if you prefer, committed, if you want to use a milder word, so committed to Ukraine that they are pressing ahead with a loan idea which, based on everything I can see, is now in very serious trouble. Now, that then, of course, brings us to the Ukrainian side of the picture, because we're now getting more and more indications of what Zelensky's so-called victory plan consists of. And there are certain comments that I've seen floating around on the internet which are being attributed to his Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. Now, here I must make an immediate qualification, because I am not sure, actually, that Yermak has, in fact, made these comments. I've seen no independent corroboration that he has done so. This is all based on second and third hand sources, and it may be wrong. But allegedly or reputedly, what he has said, I'm not sure to whom, maybe to Ursula von der Leyen, is that Ukraine is in dire straits. Its situation on the battlefield is critical, that it is definitely losing the war, that it cannot sustain the war for much longer, and certainly not forever, and that since negotiations with the Russians are impossible on the terms that Putin is insisting on, Istanbul plus, with Ukraine forfeiting the entirety of the four regions, as well as Crimea, the only way out is for a massive escalation by the West. That means, in effect, NATO's direct participation in the war. And in order to cover that and to agree to it, NATO must agree that Ukraine join NATO before the end of this year. And that, we are told, and this is, as I said, all based on third-party sources, that, we're told, is the essence of what Zelensky's victory plan is. Well, if this is the victory plan, then I'm going to say straight away that I think it is inconceivable that it will be accepted. The very fact that Ukraine is losing the war, the very fact that the Ukrainians are supposedly saying that the only way they can win the war is through the direct participation, the direct involvement of NATO in the war itself, is going to be enough to persuade some European governments, and I suspect the Pentagon itself, to tell the Ukrainians, well, that's it, we can't continue with this any longer. There's no conceivable way that we are prepared to go to war on your behalf with the Russians in the nuclear age. That, I suspect, is the message that the Ukrainians are going to be receiving over the next few weeks. Now, it could be that Yermak's words have been either misrepresented or perhaps straightforwardly invented. But there's a number of things to say. Firstly, Zelensky himself has made public comments, and about these there is no doubt because you can find them on the internet. Zelensky has said that the situation of the Ukrainian military is very, very difficult. It's particularly critical in two places, in the Pokrovsk area and in the Kursk area. And as we will see shortly about that, Zelensky is absolutely right. So it is the case that Ukraine is losing the war. The article in the Washington Post by David Ignatius essentially told us exactly the same thing, that as Yermak is supposed to have said, that Ukraine cannot continue this prolonged war. The war is grinding Ukraine down. The attrition is unbearable. Ukraine is close to collapse. That was essentially the point that even David Ignatius was making, or at least it will collapse eventually. It cannot continue on this course forever. And again, that mirrors again exactly what Yermak is reputed to have said. So it is plausible that the Ukrainians are telling the West this, that we cannot negotiate. Putin's proposals are completely unacceptable to us. At the same time, we cannot win. We cannot win by ourselves. We are losing the war. Our resources are nowhere near enough. Russia's resources are all but limitless. We are being ground down. We can't go on fighting like this forever. And it is not implausible to me at all that what the Ukrainians are telling the Western powers is this. Either you go in, you go all in, you bring us into NATO, you give us all the weapons we want, you allow us to conduct deep strikes wherever we want inside Russia, and you participate in the war yourselves directly by admitting us into NATO so that we can invoke Article 5, or we are going to lose, and the debacle, the defeat, will be as much yours as ours. That, I suspect, is the message, is the actual message that the Ukrainians are giving at this time. Now, I suspect that's going to be very unwelcome in Western capitals. Reports unanimously say that there is no appetite in European capitals for direct confrontation, a direct war with the Russians. I think that if Zelensky comes to New York and starts proposing these ideas, he's going to find that he's going to run into overwhelming resistance. And the Pentagon, for its part, continues to put its foot down. They've just made further statements over the last 24 hours that they cannot see any military advantage to allowing deep strikes into Russia. All major Russian military assets are beyond the range of the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. And the fact that the Pentagon is in effect talking in this way further points to the Pentagon's own unwillingness to become directly involved in a conflict with Russia. Anyway, if this is true, if all of these reports are true, then we are indeed at a make or break moment. I suspect that the Western powers are going to respond to these demands from Zelensky in a somewhat different way. They'll say, well, look, we will continue to support you. We will give you whatever we can. We're increasingly short of things now, but as Ursula von der Leyen has said, we'll still give you money. We'll still give you some arms. We'll still give you some shells. You must continue fighting. But if you cannot defeat the Russians on the battlefield, if, as you say, the situation on the battlefield is as bad for you as you are telling us, then really what you must do is try to find some route to a ceasefire, to a freeze of the conflict, and in order to avoid the final disaster. And that then throws it back to the Ukrainians. And as I've said already, politically, that may be very difficult for the Ukrainians to do. Now, of course, there is one further possibility, and that is that Zelensky and Yermak and all of these others are telling the West these things precisely because they know that the West will not agree to them, and that they're going to turn round and tell the Ukrainian people at some point within the next few weeks or months that Ukraine cannot continue the war, that the war is being lost, that the losses are impossibly high. And they called on the West for help, and the West refused. And in light of that refusal, which of course some Ukrainians will describe as a betrayal, Ukraine has no alternative other than to come to terms with Russia, to agree to negotiate and to go for a ceasefire. Well, I have to say that would be the logical thing for the Ukrainians to do. In my opinion, if that's what they're thinking, the more logical thing still would be for them to go directly to the Russians now and say, look, we're losing the war. Let's negotiate. Let's see whether we can come to terms. And of course, there's always, at that point, the big question about what the Russians will say. It's always important to remember, and this is something that Western capitals always ignore, that the Russians also have a say in this matter. They may turn around and say to the Ukrainians, look, we're prepared to talk with you, but we're not prepared to undertake a ceasefire unless you do what Putin said back in June, which is pull out completely from the 4 regions. If you don't do that, the war goes on. And it may be that that's something that the Ukrainians cannot agree to, and that it might provoke a major political crisis in Ukraine if they do try to agree to it. It may be that even after Zelensky presents his people, if that's indeed his plan, I'm not convinced, by the way, that it even is his plan. It may be that if Zelensky turns to his people and says, look, we have to have peace, or at least a ceasefire now, and accept the loss of our territories, at least for the time being, because the Russians are too strong and the West won't help us. It could very well be that that provokes a violent or furious or angry reaction from the hardliners in Kiev, and Zelensky doesn't survive it, and then the war continues in some other form. But anyway, all of this is interesting. It further suggests to me that in terms of the military conflict, we are now definitely entering the end game. The Ukrainians, as I say, as I've said many times, I think realized in July that they could not win the war. That, in fact, not only could they not win the war, but that they were going to be defeated in the war. And I think Western governments over the last few weeks have come to that same realization. But there continues to be paralysis, there continue to be far-fetched and extraordinary plans, missile strikes deep inside Russia, demands that Ukraine join NATO immediately, talk about sending, or at least the West, intervening directly in the conflict in Ukraine, all of these kind of things. Loans for Ukraine, which it can never repay, and which are based on proceeds from Russian assets, which are probably insufficient to cover the loans anyway, and about which there are major legal question marks. The fact that all of these strange and ultimately unworkable ideas are floating around tell me, at least, that we are now entering the end game. Anyway, let's now go to the actual military situation in Ukraine at the moment, because, of course, it is the military situation that ultimately determines the shape of the eventual settlement. Now, before I do that, before I start talking about what's going on the various battlefronts and where the fighting is taking place, let me just return briefly to the topic of that Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian ammunition and base in Tver region. And there's been an awful lot of talk about the importance of this attack. I've seen claims from various sources that the entire complex has been destroyed. But as I've said previously, the satellite pictures don't seem to show that. They suggest that whilst there's been extensive damage in part of the complex, the main bunkers where most of the more sensitive material is located are intact, and that suggests that though there was extensive damage, the damage is limited and that the complex is far from destroyed, as some are claiming. Now, Simplicius the Thinker has found a comment of Sergei Shoigu's, made, I believe, last year, when Shoigu was still Russian defense minister, in which Shoigu said that on an average day, the Russian armed forces in the special military operation used between 10 and 15,000 tons of material, absorb around 10 to 15,000 tons of material. And Simplicius the Thinker pointed out that the total capacity of this warehouse in Tver, if it was at absolute full capacity, it can house around 19,000 tons of material. And he makes the point that even if the entire facility had been destroyed, which of course it hasn't been, that's less than 2 days of what the Russian army uses in Ukraine, in the special military operation in Ukraine. Well, I think that is actually not entirely correct. First of all, if you look at Shoigu's words, when he talks about 10 to 15,000 tons, he includes fuel oil. And as I understand it, most of the stockpiles in this facility would have been weapons, shells, firearms, missiles, that kind of thing. So 19,000 pieces, 19,000 munitions, 19,000 tons of munitions is not the same, is not exactly comparable to 10 to 15,000 tons of munitions and fuel oils and food and things of that kind. So just saying, we're not talking about exactly identical things. Now, there is obviously an overlap. I don't know what proportion of the 10 to 15,000 tons that Shoigu was talking about is made up of munitions. But I'm going to guess that a significant part of it was. And overall, I would agree with Simplikis the thinker. I don't think it's 2 days of material which might have been destroyed had the entire complex been destroyed. Maybe it's equivalent to 2 or 3 weeks of military material. And of course, if we're talking about certain specialized rockets, for example, it might be much more difficult to replace those. But I think even if he's overstating things, he is making a valid point. Given the amount of material that the Russian army uses every day in the Ukrainian battlefields, whatever was achieved in the attack on this warehouse complex near Tver is only going to dent the Russian military a little. It is not going to change the overall picture very much. Now, there's been an article in the Washington Post by a US journalist, Mr. Lee Hochstadter, which in a kind of a way bears on this point. He says that the losing is an opinion piece, the losing strategy of underestimating Russia. Russia remains a formidable power. The West should not assume it is a depleted force. Now, the article is full of a lot of the usual stereotypes. Russia's corrupt, Russia's inefficient, Russia's all sorts of things. It's kleptocratic, it's led by a delusional autocrat, all of those things. But nonetheless, he does acknowledge the fact that Russia remains a major global power. And put it like this: if Russia is a corrupt, retrograde, legalistic power, it remains a power. Given the West's pattern of misreading Moscow's resilience, it's worth taking stock of the menace it still poses far beyond Ukrainian borders. And then he talks about the enormous power of the Russian military, not just the army, but the fleet, the air force, all of these things. He concedes something that various people find very difficult to acknowledge, that the various missile strikes on vessels of the Black Sea Fleet have done no significant damage to the Russian Navy overall. Much has been made of Ukraine's impressive success in sinking or crippling a chunk of Putin's Black Sea Fleet, but with a couple of exceptions. The Chatham House study says that the ships destroyed or disabled were very old or limited vessels. The Russian Navy has lost none of its blue water capability, and Moscow's global power projection capabilities are undiminished. The point the article makes is that Russia retains enormous resources. It has the ability to project power in all sorts of places hopes, as he puts it, have receded that Russia can be defeated on the battlefield, or that its economy will crumble under the weight of US-led sanctions, and that given the huge resources that the Russians have, any strategy that is based on the idea of exhausting the Russians is foolish and dangerous and probably cannot be sustained. And that brings us back to the attack on the warehouse. Warehouse might be a big warehouse, it might contain lots of munitions, but it is only going to dent a military system that is enormous on a scale that no Western country, apart from the United States, can hope to match. The Russians can absorb attacks like this and take them in their stride, and to an outsider, it might not even be noticed. Just saying. So let's move to the situation on the battlefronts. And the situation, in fact, as Zelensky has said, and perhaps Yermak has conceded, is getting extremely bad. And let's start, first of all, with Kursk, because according to Group of Forces North, the Russian military continues its advance in the Kursk area, and Group of Forces North, without ever providing us with a huge amount of detail, tells us that the Russians have advanced a further kilometre. In fact, we now have reports from the battlefronts that after the Russian capture of the villages of Darino and Nikolaevo Darino on the western flank of the Ukrainian enclave in Kursk, that the vanguard forces of the Russian military pushing eastwards have now reached the outskirts of the important village of Sverdlikovo. Now, Sverdlikovo is another one of these villages that Ukraine captured in the early days of the Kursk operation. If the Russians capture Sverdlikovo, then I think we can say that the enclave that the Ukrainians have in Kursk is an enclave no longer. It is instead a pocket, and a pocket which is about to transform into a cauldron, because the Russians appear to be advancing from other directions as well. They seem to be pushing from Malaya Lochnia, which is located to the north of Sudzha. This place, Sverdlikovo, is located to the west of Sudzha. And as we know, the Russians have established firm control of places like Ruskaya Konopielka and Borki, and are moving towards another village called Plechovo. All of these located east of Sudzha, on either side of the main road, the H200 road, which is the only significant road that the Ukrainian forces can use to keep their troops in the Kursk region supplied. So it will become a pocket, a relatively small pocket, a very unstable pocket, located around the small town of Sudzha, about 5,000 people, and one which quite plausibly the Russians could cut off and surround fairly quickly. So this is, to put it mildly, concerning news for the Ukrainians, and it strongly suggests that the Kursk operation is going, well, it's not just turning badly wrong, but it is shaping into a potential disaster for Ukraine. Now, Group of Forces North has a number of further comments to make about the situation in Kursk region. They say that the past 24 hours have broken another record for losses in the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces. And they say that the Ukrainians have lost 600 people in the northern in Kharkiv, Kursk and Sumy region, of whom 480 were lost in the Sumy direction, which includes, of course, Kursk. And they go on to say that the Ukrainian command is not going to stop there. They're going to send more people, more of the few and expensive Western machines to try to hold on to their positions. And the reason, basically, that they're doing this is because the Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian government, cannot accept a retreat from Kursk region at this point in the war, especially at a time when Zelensky is due to travel to New York to meet the leaders of the West and to try to address the global community. So they are going to continue to throw away men and machines, trying to defend this increasingly unstable pocket in the Kursk region, even as the Russians close in. And the risk they run, the real risk they run, of course, is that by doing that, their forces in Kursk could become completely surrounded and the whole territory could become a cauldron. Well, I think that this is true. By the way, the Ukrainian offensive in the Glushkovo area of Kursk appears to have become a total debacle. The Ukrainians seem to have made a further attempt to try to advance in this area south of the Sime River. Apparently, they were defeated, according to the Russians, and according to some Ukrainian reports as well. They were defeated in this precise area and again suffered very heavy losses. And it's clear that they were unable to break through and capture any territory. This is what Group of Forces North says about this battle. In the Glushkovo district, Ukrainian armed forces with up to a company of personnel on 6 armoured fighting vehicles supported by 2 Leopard tanks. I'm guessing now, by the way, that these are Leopard 1 tanks. And engineering equipment made another attempt to break through in the direction of the village of Vesyoloye. The advance was discovered in advance by reconnaissance, and fire damage was inflicted by artillery and drones. The enemy lost up to 30 men, 1 Leopard tank, 4 armoured fighting vehicles, and 1 engineering vehicle. The attack was thwarted. So, whole operation in Kursk is becoming not just bogged down, but it's turning into I think it's the word disaster for the Ukrainian military is not an overstatement. Now, there is a further twist to the story of the Kursk offensive, because there's a report today in The Guardian, which is based on Russian military material, documents and things of that kind, which the Ukrainians appear to have captured when they seized Suja. And the reports, these documents, confirm, it's taking this from The Guardian, appear to confirm that the Russians did anticipate that there would be a Ukrainian attack on Kursk. Now, this is really most remarkable, but anyway, this is what the article in part says. Russia's military command had anticipated Ukraine's incursion into its Kursk region and had been making plans to prevent it for several months. according to a cache of documents that the Ukrainian army said it had seized from abandoned Russian positions in the region. And one goes on to read that unit commanders were given instructions to prepare the soldiers psychologically for the battle, and there's all sorts of references to printed orders, handwritten logs, recording events and discussing positions. And we're told that most of this information comes from a single Russian unit of the 488th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, and in particular the 2nd Company of its 17th Battalion. And anyway, we then learned that the Russians, at least the assumption the Ukrainians have, is that the Russians were taken nonetheless by surprise, that there was disarray, and that this somehow points to disorganization and incompetence on the part of the Russian command. Well, that is one view. I'm going to make a suggestion that here we have further evidence to support what that source of mine told me when he contacted me 2 months before the start of the Kursk operation, that the Russians did in fact know that the Ukrainians were intending to launch an operation in the Kursk region, an operation which apparently, according to the cache of documents that the Ukrainians have retrieved, the Russians knew would focus on the capture of the town of Sudzha, that would be the initial objective of the Ukrainian forces. That the Russians had a fairly good and clear and accurate idea of what it was that the Ukrainians were going to do, and that at some point they made a decision that rather than try to prevent it, they were going to let the Ukrainians steamroll into Kursk and lay a trap for the Ukrainians there. Now, I want to make it very clear. I am not saying that these documents, which, by the way, I'm sure are authentic, these are real Russian documents. I am not saying that these documents corroborate what my source told me, that the Russians were laying a trap for the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. But here I would suggest is one further piece of evidence which rather supports that idea and what my source has been telling me. As I've said many times, if you're told something which, however implausible it may seem to you, gets continuously supported by evidence, all the evidence that you are seeing, there comes a point where it becomes absurd to continue to deny or dispute the information that you're being given. And here we have another piece of the puzzle. The Russians apparently did know well in advance. The Guardian tells us months in advance, just as my source said, that the Ukrainians were preparing to conduct an attack in the Kursk region. And, well, it doesn't prove in itself that they laid a trap, but I've been told that by all sorts, but by this particular source, who probably informed me of this at roughly the same time that these documents that the Guardian has seen were written, and that the Russians took a decision to lay a trap, and, well, we see the results. Anyway, I'm going to move on, but I will be very, very interested to see what comes out eventually in the memoir literature once this war is over, what the various participants on the Russian side have to say about the entire Kursk operation and how it was prepared and how it was eventually won. Just saying. Anyway, Kursk, in my opinion, remains something of a sideshow in terms of this war, though an increasingly expensive one for Ukraine. It is one where the Ukrainians are being particularly bled dry, and we've had repeated reports telling us this, which have been appearing in the Western media, one by CNN that I discussed some days ago, and of course we've had David Ignatius's report in the Washington Post, which tells us in general that Ukraine is bleeding out. Anyway, let's turn now to what's going on in other places on the battlefronts. And let's start in that area, one of the two areas where Zelensky says that the situation for the Ukrainians is critical. Now, I'm going to suggest that there has been, over the last couple of days, a very serious deterioration of the military situation for the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk itself. I mean specifically the city of Pokrovsk and its eastern suburb, Mirnograd. And I say that because I've now read reports that the Russians are 4 kilometers from Mirnograd. They're still supposedly 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk itself, but they are now shelling Pokrovsk. This is not just bombing operations or missile strikes being conducted against Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is now being systematically shelled by the Russian artillery, Russian tube artillery. Now, Russian guns can have ranges of 25 kilometers using special ammunition. It can be even further than that. But if they've started to shell Pokrovsk in the volumes that I've been reading about, specifically in Redovka, and which appear to be confirmed on the Ukrainian side, it does suggest that they are indeed within 10 kilometers of Pokrovsk and that they have established stable and secure positions there so that they can bring out their artillery and their artillery can start shelling Pokrovsk and without fear of interference or attack or counter-battery fire from the Ukrainian side. And of course that article in Ukrainska Pravda told us that the Ukrainians are very short of artillery in this area and extremely short of shells, and that they are not in a position to conduct counter-battery fire against the Russian artillery in the Pokrovsk area. So it looks as if the Russians have advanced closer to Pokrovsk and that they have now established a secure bridgehead close to Pokrovsk itself so that they're now able to shell the city. One still gets a lot of confusion as to exactly where the various forces in this part of the northern battlefields are located. Whether the Russians, for example, control the villages of Kruty Yar and Krasno Yar and Nikolaevka to the north of Novogrodivka, whether they control all of Novogrodivka. The Ukrainian mapping project, DS, has all but conceded, by the way, in the case of Grodivka, that they do. Whether the Russians have pushed west from Novogrodivka and captured places like Suhoya and Lisivska and places like that. As to the latter, I am not sure, but in a sense it hardly matters. The Russians are now systematically shelling Pokrovsk, and according to their own accounts, they're now systematically shelling the roads that lead both into Pokrovsk and through Pokrovsk, including the main supply road, the great supply road, leading from Pokrovsk all the way to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, further east. And Radovka says something else. They say that the Russians are now within artillery range, comfortable artillery range, of the railways leading into Pokrovsk, and they've been able to shell the railways, including the railway station in Pokrovsk itself. And the result is that troop and equipment trains coming from Dnipro in the west can no longer reach Pokrovsk. There is another railway line from the north towards which goes to Mirnograd, and there is a railway station in Mirnograd that apparently, according to Radovka, is still just out of range, so the Ukrainians can, for the moment, still use that railway line, but the other railway lines around Pokrovsk the other main railway line around Pokrovsk, in effect, has been closed. Now, all of this points to a marked deterioration of the situation in Pokrovsk. It suggests to me that the Ukrainian positions around Pokrovsk are much weaker than some of the mapping projects perhaps understand. I am not saying that Pokrovsk is about to be stormed by the Russian army, or that it's going to fall tomorrow, or anything of that kind. But it does seem to me that the Battle of Pokrovsk has, in effect, now formally begun. Now, further south, we still get some people who insist that the coal mine and slag heap north of Selidovo are under Ukrainian control. I don't know one way or the other. I am not there. But the article that I read the other day in Ukrainska Pravda, which discussed the military situation in this area and spoke about the many problems that the Ukrainian military faces in the Pokrovsk area, it wrote as if this coal mine and slag heap north of Selidovo was indeed under Russian control. Maybe they are confusing it with the other coal mine and slag heap a little to the east, the one that is connected to the village of Mikhailovka. I'm not in a position to say. But anyway, I just point this out, that we have information from what one assumes is a reliable Ukrainian source, which on its face, at least to me, seems to confirm that the coal mine and slag heap located north of Selidovo is indeed under Russian control. Anyway, that there is fighting in eastern Selidovo, I don't think anybody any longer disputes. The Ukrainian counterattack in that area appears to have come to a stop. The Russians are in firm control of Mikhailovka itself. But of course, the big events, the most important events in this area continue to happen somewhat to the south, where the Russians have recently captured Ukrainsk, and where, by all accounts, they have now entered Girnik. The next town, population around 10,000, located south of Ukrainsk, and there's said to be a storming operation underway within Ukrainsk. There are reports that the Russians control already around half of Ukrainsk. There's no corroboration of this. These are just reports that we're seeing. There's no pictures or film. But then maybe at this stage of this battle, one shouldn't expect that. I, again, don't know exactly where the Russians are located. But if the Russians do already control half of Ukrainsk, it would absolutely not surprise me. And there are also reports that the Russians advancing west from Ukrainsk have now captured and gained control of the coal mine and slag heap located northeast of Tsukurinye, which must presumably be their next objective. So if the Russians control Tsukurinye, then capture Tsukurinye, and if they are indeed in control of this coal mine, then as several people have pointed out, the Russians are already astride one of the main roads leading south from Selidovo to Kurakovo and the other towns in the Kurakovo area, still Ukrainian controlled. But anyway, exactly what's going on, maybe one shouldn't jump too far ahead, but the direction of travel is very clear. And in this same area, of course, the Russians controlled the village, captured a few days ago, the village of Zhelanya Persha, and they seem to be moving steadily through the fields north of Krasnogorovka and west of Nivolskoye. I'm going to repeat my own belief. I don't think there are any Ukrainians in these fields. The reason why the Russians are moving through the fields slowly is because they're worried about mines and booby traps in the long grass, and in order to deploy their forces through these fields, they need to move carefully and cautiously and demine these fields as they move west. And of course, when they do clear these fields, which they will very soon, probably within the next couple of days, that will bring them into direct contact with the Russian troops in Zhelanya Persha, and next to the village, on the outskirts of the village of Zhelanya Druha, which will, of course, rapidly, in that case, fall. And we will see a junction of the Russian forces in the area of Girnik, which will, of course, also fall. And then we will have a continuous Russian front line located very close to the key town of Kurakovo, south of the reservoir. So that's, it seems to me, the overall situation on this part of the battlefront. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians. That's what Ukrainska Pravda tells us. They have more artillery, more machines, more tanks and armoured vehicles, far more drones. Putin recently visited a drone factory in St. Petersburg and had another meeting there with his military industrial people, and said that Russia now produces drones at a rate of 4,000 a day, which is far beyond what Ukraine can achieve. And he also said, by the way, that Russian drone production has increased tenfold over last year, which gives us an idea of the sense of scale. And anyway, the Russians are far stronger. The Ukrainska Pravda article told us that the Ukrainians are disorganized, that their command system is unstable, that their fortified lines are often in the wrong places, and that means that the Russians can steadily and incrementally move to tie this whole area up. Now, further south, the Russian Defense Ministry finally confirmed that the village of Georgievka, located to the west of Marinka and reasonably close to Kurakovo, east of Kurakovo, that Georgievka is now under complete Russian control. In fact, we have known this for months. The actual fighting in this area is taking place in the next village to the west of Georgievka, which is Maximilianovka. There continues to be fighting in Maximilianovka. I'm going to suggest that the reason the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that Georgievka has fallen under Russian control is because in the next few weeks, perhaps even in the next week, we're going to get news that Maximilianovka has fallen under Russian control as well. And the next inhabited place west of Maximilianovka and very close to Maximilianovka is, of course, Kurachovo. So we could see how the Russian tide is now closing on all of these places. Further south still, in the Vuhledar area, the Russians seem to be in firm control of the coal mine South Donbass number 3, located to the northwest of Vodyane. There is still uncertainty as to whether they control the entirety of coal mine South Donbass number 1, located north of Vuhledar itself. But as a number of people have been pointing out, Military Summary Channel had a report about this. The other big story is that the Russians are now conducting major bombing, artillery and drone offensives against all of the various Ukrainian positions in all the various villages, Novoukrainska, Shakhtorsk, Bogoyavlenka, all of these villages in this area, in a way that suggests that some major Russian offensive in this area is being prepared, a major storming operation to capture all of these territories and presumably to end the battle for Vuhledar once and for all. And for the record, I now think, my own sense is that the point where the Ukrainians could withdraw from Vuhledar and do so with some hope of maintaining unit cohesion, retaining most of their men, even if they had to give up most of their supplies. I think that point has been passed. I think that not only has the fate of Vuhledar been sealed, but I'm sorry to say, I think the fate of the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar has now in effect been sealed as well. Now, elsewhere in the war, in the battles, there's been more reports, still more reports of further Russian advances within Toretsk itself. Again, Radovka was talking about the Russians storming the central area of Toretsk, and it's been suggested that if the Russians capture this territory, then the rest of Toretsk will collapse almost immediately, that it'll be impossible for the Ukrainians to hold on to Toretsk much longer. And similar claims now are being made about the situation in Chasiv Yar, that the Russians have begun the storming operation of the remaining high-rise building area in the northwestern part of Chasiv Yar. And again, it's again suggested that if this territory falls under Russian control, then Chasiv Yar will also fall. And, well, there are also very complicated Russian operations taking place close to Kupiansk, where the Russians continue to push forward from Siversk, where they seem to be, from Sinkovka, where the Russians continue to storm the village of Petropavlivka, which is located immediately to the east of Kupiansk. The Russians are definitely apparently in this village, but there's also lots of reports that the Russians are now rapidly enlarging the territory that they control. Just south of Kupiansk, in the village, near the village of Peshanye. These are very complicated operations. I'm not able to give a detailed account of them. All I will say is that it looks as if large areas of territory are passing under Russian control to the east of the Oskol River, and a little further south, in the village of Makeyevka, the Russians have crossed the Zherebets River, and it seems that Makeyevka itself is fully under Russian control. And to repeat again the point made by David Ignatius, Ukraine, even as this continues, is bleeding out. We've seen the complex, bizarre story of the loan, the Western loan. We see that funding from the West for Ukraine is frittering out. We see also that military supplies for Ukraine appear to be dwindling as well. And if it's true that Ukraine is demanding that it be brought into NATO within the next few weeks, then that is a clear sign of how desperate the situation in the war has become. As I said, I think we are at the start of the end game. The end game, as anybody who plays chess, which I do very badly, by the way, but anybody who plays chess will know, is the most difficult part of chess. I think that's almost where we are, and, well, we shall see. Anyway, elsewhere in the Middle East, the Israelis continue airstrikes on southern Lebanon. There's not so far been, so far as I can see, a major Israeli military incursion into Lebanon. I suspect that there is an enormous amount of diplomatic activity going on. I will cover all of that in my next program. But this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And lastly, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.